This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning and welcome to our Alaska Collaborative on Health and the Environment teleconference on toxic chemicals in the home and the recent study by Duke University on flame retardants in furniture. We're joined today by Dr. Heather Stapleton, lead author of the study, and Pamela Miller, Executive Director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. My name is Diana DeFazio, and on behalf of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, I'll be facilitating today's call. CHE-Alaska is a regional partnership group of the National Collaborative on Health and the Environment. And CHE-Alaska aims to advance knowledge and effective action to address growing concerns about the links between human health and environmental factors. You can find more information on the following websites: akaction.org and healthandenvironment.org. The call will last 1 hour. Everyone who signed up should have received an email this morning with a link to the call webpage where you will find Dr. Stapleton's presentation. If you haven't done so already, please take a moment to download her presentation. You can also go to the Alaska Community Action on Toxics homepage at akaction.org and click on the title of today's call to get to the call webpage. We're holding this call today because Alaska Community Action on Toxics works at the state, national, and international levels to eliminate certain toxic flame retardant chemicals from production and use. Many of these chemicals are widely used in everyday products, such as furniture and electronics, and they leach out into the environment, where they wind up in our water, fish, wildlife, and our own bodies. As we will hear later from Pam Miller, flame retardants are among the persistent pollutants that are accumulating in the Arctic. Today, we are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Heather Stapleton, one of the leading researchers working to identify flame retardant chemicals in products and to understand their long-term fate in the environment. Heather Stapleton is Associate Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment. Dr. Stapleton's experience lies in the fate and transformation of organic contaminants in aquatic systems and indoor environments. Her research focuses on several types of persistent organic pollutants, including polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, and brominated flame retardants, with a focus on polybrominated diphenyl ethers, or PBDEs. Dr. Stapleton received her PhD in environmental chemistry at the University of Maryland in 2003 and joined the Duke University faculty in 2005. Welcome, Heather. Would you like to begin? I can't hear you, so if you could just press *2.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Wonderful.
Sorry, I was trying to use the mute button on my phone, but I guess it didn't work. Well, thank you for that very nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to talk to everyone about a little bit about the research that we've been doing in my laboratory. I hope everyone has the presentation available in front of you. I'll try to go through it slide by slide and call out the different slides as I proceed. So just to begin and moving to slide 2, a little bit about the outline. I have structured this presentation to give you a brief background on flame retardant chemicals, discuss a little bit related to regulations that govern the use of these chemicals in some of the commercial products, talk about the different types of flame retardants that are out there and the applications in consumer products, discuss a little bit about exposure, particularly during early development, particularly children's exposure to flame retardants, and then focus on the 2 studies that we've done recently identifying these types of chemicals and their loadings in furniture specifically, and wrap that up talking about some of the newer chemicals that are now in the market to replace some of these mixtures that have been phased out due to human health concerns, and then hopefully open it up for a little bit of conclusions and discussions. So moving to slide 3, I've included here a kind of a definition of, broad definition of flame retardants as defined by the World Health Organization, which is a substance added or a treatment applied to material in order to suppress, significantly reduce, or delay the combustion of materials. And I think it's important to make everyone aware that these chemicals are added to typically different types of resins and polymers that are found in consumer products, really not to prevent them from catching fire, but really to slow down the rate at which they burn, because all these products that contain these materials still burn. They just are intended to burn at a slower rate. Although there's, as we'll discuss a little bit later, there's some ambiguity about what type of benefits they actually offer in these products. But most chemicals that we're aware of as used as flame retardants are typically used in furniture or electronic products. And in the United States, most residential furniture is treated with flame retardant chemicals really to meet a California state flammability standard referred to as California Technical Bulletin 117. And there's a picture here of a label that is found on most furniture that meets this requirement, stating this article meets the flammability requirements of California Bureau of Home Furnishings Technical Bulletin 117. If any furniture product contains this label or has this label present, and it also contains polyurethane foam, it definitely has flame retardants in it. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the study we conducted and published on a few months ago. In the case of electronics, it's a little bit different. In computers and televisions and DVD players and cell phones even, being made from polymers, there's concerns about them generating heat and potentially catching fire, particularly televisions, because there have been cases in the past where fires have started either with a candle on top of the television set in those old larger CRT units, or sometimes the heat generated from them. Therefore, most units, electronic items that are manufactured today, are certified for flammability standards really through Underwriters Laboratory for insurance purposes. So that governs a lot of use of these chemicals in electronic purposes. And then there's certainly other applications of flame retardants in children's sleepwear sometimes, and even things like seating, drapes, insulations, particularly in public buildings that have to meet different fire codes. But today we're going to be talking primarily about their use in chemical use in residential furniture. So advancing to slide 4, here's just a picture of a few things that might contain flame retardants in your home that you're probably very familiar with. You can see furniture items, drapes, some curtains are often treated with flame retardants. The pink rectangle is actually a piece of polystyrene insulation that is used in most homes. There's even some reports of applications in recreational camping equipment, small appliances, Christmas lights, obviously the TVs, as I mentioned before, and then some baby products, like I have here a picture of a car seat, a nursing pillow, and an infant sleep positioner, and I'll talk more about this as we've done research on these items as well. Moving to slide 5, in case anyone's interested about how these types of flame retardants work, the class of flame retardants we're focusing on today are really halogenated additive flame retardants, or some phosphate-based as well. But the halogenated flame retardants work because the halogen has a relatively weak bond with the carbon backbone on all of these flame retardants. And so an ideal flame retardant will decompose before the material it's protecting. So in furniture, for example, as you have increasing temperatures and increasing heat, one of the first bonds to break in a chemical is a carbon-bromine bond, which generates these radicals, which scavenge these hydroxyl radicals and hydrogen radicals that are present that really propagate a fire reaction. So what it's trying to do is just quench the reactions that propagate a fire. So it just delays that rate of combustion. But again, these products will still burn. They just burn at a slower rate. Advancing to slide 6. Most flame retardants are classified into 2 groups, which are called either reactive flame retardants or additive flame retardants. Reactive flame retardants actually have a chemical bond between the flame retardant chemical and the product they're protecting. So they are less likely to leach out because they are more strongly attached to that material. In contrast, additive flame retardants are really just mixed in typically during what they call the extrusion process for something like a polyurethane foam. They're basically just dumping in this flame retardant chemical as they're putting the ingredients for foam together, and then it starts as a liquid and expands slowly into a solid material. So there's no chemical bond between these flame retardant chemicals and the product they protect, and therefore they can leach out over time. And typically they're at percent levels, which makes it more likely for them to leach out over time. So the PBDEs, which have received a lot of attention and scrutiny over the past 2 decades, are all classes of additive flame retardants. And typically there have been 3 commercial mixtures marketed as flame retardants, and they are often referred to as penta, octa, and deca. So if we advance to slide 7, there's just a little more specific information on these 3 commercial mixtures. The penta mixture, DD71, which is how it is also sometimes referred to, was primarily used to meet California Technical Bulletin 117, and its primary application was in foam found in residential furniture. It's estimated that 98% of the world market demand for that mixture was actually used in foam in both the United States and Canada, which likely explains why the U.S. and Canadian populations have much higher levels than any other country in the world. And this is also the most bioaccumulative commercial mixture out there. The components in this mixture are much more bioaccumulative and can biomagnify to greater degrees than the other two commercial mixtures. So most of its application was in the foam. The Octa mixture, in contrast, was primarily used in what we call ABS plastics. That's found often in business equipment, things like fax machines and printers. And the third mixture, Deca, is actually the largest flame retardant, largest PBDE flame retardant mixture sold by volume. It's primarily used in high-impact polystyrene, which is often found in the casings of televisions and computers, although it does have some applications to the back coating of textiles and furniture as well. But that's primarily in electronics. And it actually is a mixture that's almost entirely comprised of one BDE congener. It's 97% of that mixture is a decabromodiphenyl ethane, or decabromodiphenyl ether, excuse me. And of the three mixtures, it's the only one that is still technically used today. The penta and octa mixtures were voluntarily phased out in the U.S. due to mounting concerns about their persistence and potential toxicity. But the Deca mixture, it is slated for phase out this year, is my understanding. And so most of the U.S. manufacturers have agreed to stop using it. And however, there's some concerns since the EPA's significant new use rule has not gone into effect yet, that there could be imports, particularly from Asia, containing Deca materials or Deca applications as well. So we'll have to just wait and see, I guess, how this SNUR rule, whether it's passed or not, and how this affects use of Deca in the future. Moving to slide 8. I'm just providing you a little bit of background of information on PBDEs and how they compare to some other persistent pollutants that have similar structures. There's a diagram to your left that demonstrates the structure of a PBDE, which is the second one down, relative to other classic persistent pollutants like polychlorinated biphenyls and dioxins and furans. They all have very similar structures in that they contain these aromatic backbones and they're often halogenated. Thus, some of the health concerns or endpoints are very similar. They're all very persistent. They can all biomagnify. There's certainly concerns about cancer for some of the PBDE applications, but with regards to the penta mixture in particular, most of the both animal studies and human health studies that have been conducted to date demonstrate that the major concerns are really effects on thyroid hormone regulation and neural developmental outcomes, particularly in children and particularly, in pregnant women that may be exposed, which can then transfer that exposure to the developing fetus. In all animal laboratory studies, when you expose an animal to PBDEs, almost all studies have seen a drop in the circulating levels of a thyroid hormone called thyroxine or T4. And these PBDE molecules have a very similar chemical structure to these endogenous thyroid hormones, which is likely why they have such an impact. So animal studies all demonstrate a change in thyroid hormone levels, and some of the human health studies, epi studies, have seen the same association, although they seem to go in opposite trends. Wherein they decrease thyroid hormone levels in animals, they seem to be associated with higher thyroid hormone levels in humans, which is interesting and really isn't clear why that is. It could be species-specific related. It's really just not clear. But thyroid hormones are also very important in neural development itself, influencing brain development in the fetus, for example. And several studies now have tracked children looking at their exposure at birth and then following up to monitor neural development, and have found that children that are born with higher levels of PBDEs in their bloodstream at birth, whether through cord blood or through blood samples from the children, have found that they are more likely to score negatively on neurodevelopmental tests later in life, primarily related to cognitive function and behavior. And most of these studies have been conducted in children around the age of 5 to 7. So there have been 2 studies now that have seen this same association in the U.S. population and one also in Europe. And that's actually very similar to some of the neuro studies that have been done in rodents as well, where there's also this effect seen that manifests into adulthood with some rodents when they're exposed during these pre- and postnatal periods early in life. So those are the 2 health points that are of most concern right now for the PBDEs, and most of these studies are focused on the penta mixture that was used in furniture. And again, the penta and octa were phased out in 2005. However, we do know that exposure continues despite the fact that they're not currently applied to new products on the market. So moving to slide number 9, we just kind of put together a pictorial graphic here about how we're typically exposed. It was really only until about 5 or 6 years ago that we realized exposure to these flame retardant chemicals was primarily coming from our exposure in different microenvironments, and particularly exposure in the home environment. Given their properties and similarities to PCBs and dioxins, it was first assumed that most exposure was coming through the diet. These chemicals are ubiquitous, they're persistent, they've migrated out. There are low levels present in our food supply, so we do get some exposure through the diet. However, most studies now have demonstrated that there is a very significant association between our body burdens and ambient levels in the indoor environment, particularly the home, through both levels in dust and air. So a significant part of our exposure does come through inadvertent ingestion of dust particles in the home, but we still get some exposure from our diet as well, because as I said, most food supplies still have this low-level contamination as well. Advancing to slide 10, this is just a kind of a summary of some studies that have been conducted monitoring PBDE levels in human tissues from around the world and in different countries. It's from a meta-analysis conducted by Ron Heitz and published in 2005. So here I have the different studies are color-coded based on the country where the population was sampled. And on the y-axis, you can see are the PBDE concentrations measured in human tissues. And just note that this is on a log scale. So this graph just demonstrates that the levels have been increasing exponentially over the past few decades, although data now from the U.S. does suggest that it's leveling off, which is good and is probably likely reflective of that phase out in 2005. But what's also apparent from this study is that you can see the red triangles are much higher than the blue dots and the green squares. And that's because the North American population, which is primarily here the U.S. and Canadian populations, have much higher exposure to these chemicals than other regions. And again, we attribute that to the fact that that penta mixture was primarily used in the U.S. and Canada to meet California's TB 117 flammability standard. And I'll just note that even though it says total PBDEs, most of these studies were reporting on congeners that are found in the penta mixture alone, because as I said, those are more persistent and bioaccumulative. So moving to slide 11, I just have a little bit of summary about some specific exposure studies that have been conducted to date, again, on the PBDEs. Most of these are for the penta mixture, although some of these have included measurements of congeners found in the octa and the deca mixture. As I have already stated, that most studies have seen in adults is exposure pathway both from diet and dust, so there's more studies focusing on the dust right now. And several years ago, it had been hypothesized that infants would actually have the highest exposure due to breast milk ingestion. These chemicals do transfer into the breast milk, and then infants that are feeding on breast milk would certainly get a high exposure level through the diet. However, more recent studies have really seen that it may be toddlers that have the highest body burdens of all age groups. And one of these studies was actually done in my lab, and we published last year. So the first study by Rose et al. In 2010 found that children between the ages of 2 and 5 had very high levels, much higher than adults. And then we followed this up and published a study looking at specifically at toddlers between the ages of 1 and 3, where we had paired samples of serum, house dust, and actually hand wipes. And when I say hand wipes, what I refer to are the fact that we basically took gauze wipes that had a little bit of rubbing alcohol on them and wiped the entire surface area of the hands from all these toddlers to try to estimate what the residue levels were on their hand, which they may then ingest from hand-to-mouth contact, which is a well-known characterized exposure route for contaminants and dust in toddlers. And what's really interesting from our study is that we found that actually the hand wipes were the very best predictor of the body burdens for PBDEs in this cohort, which is likely reflective of different activity patterns that the kids experience. And certainly we found that it was correlated with dust, but hand wipes were more highly correlated than the dust was. And age and race and socioeconomic status also were statistically associated with the serum PBDE levels, such that children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds had serum levels that were 2 times higher than children from higher socioeconomic status. The reason for that isn't really clear. Several studies have been really interested in this differential exposure with SES characteristics, as I've highlighted here on the bottom. There is some suggestion that maybe homes from a lower socioeconomic status might have older furniture that has deteriorated, leading to higher loadings, let's say, of these PBDEs in the dust, which is then exposed to individuals in that home. Although I can say in our study for 2012 with the toddlers, that was not the case. There's actually no difference in the PBDE dust loadings by SES category. It was more apparent in the hand wipes and the serum. So I think this is still a big question mark that we're really trying to get a better understanding of why exposure is related to socioeconomic status, and probably will continue in the future. So moving to slide 12, this is where I'll start talking about some of the work that we've been doing. So as I mentioned, the penta-BDE was phased out in 2005. And we knew the flammability standard was still in place, and there wasn't really good information out there about what flame retardants would then be used as replacements for the penta-BDEs. And so this generated a lot of questions. Whether will these other new chemicals also migrate out into the indoor dust the same way that the PBDEs do? Will we also be exposed to these chemicals, and what do we know about health effects for these flame retardants? So advancing to slide 13, and again, this penta-BDE was primarily used for California's TB117 in residential furniture, which was assumed to be a de facto standard for the entire U.S. because most manufacturers would not want to make a separate product for California, so that they were making all their products to meet the California standard. And the standard really focuses on the foam inside the furniture. So it's a standard not for, let's say, a cigarette, or a match that was lit that might hit the upholstery first, but really focuses on the foam and has no effect on the upholstery whatsoever. So that's one of the reasons we were really interested in looking at the foam inside a lot of the furniture to get a better understanding of what flame retardants were actually being applied. Now, if you advance to slide 14, the EPA has a relatively new program called the Design for the Environment, and one of their first projects was to conduct a Penta Alternatives Assessment, which is publicly available. This is one table from that report, where the goal of their project was really to collect information on viable alternatives for Penta in polyurethane foam, primarily used in furniture, and then put this report together that compared what was known about potential health effects for all these different options. So it doesn't inform you as to what the market would actually use. It just provides really information for those furniture manufacturers to make better informed choices about what flame retardants they may want to use as a replacement for penta-BDE. But if you look at this table here, hopefully everyone can read it really well. This is one table of several that is in this report. And if you look at the column on the left where it says chemical, you can see that a lot of them say proprietary, 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 proprietary. And that's because a lot of these new mixtures can be classified as confidential business information. And so the information on what those chemicals are, what their structures are, was not released to the public. And so again, there's just this big black box about what we know about what the replacements would be. So for academic researchers like myself, trying to better understand whether these replacements would lead to exposure, are they going to be better or worse than PBDEs, it was impossible to do without knowing what to look for. So that was really the genesis for the two projects that we worked on. If you move to slide 15, we've conducted two projects right now. The first was looking at flame retardant applications in foam that's found in baby products. And the second was foam used in residential furniture, and primarily focusing on couches in this case. So moving to slide 16, just a little bit of background. Both of these studies have been published now. The first one on baby products, this is the first study we did. And so what we were doing with the help of several NGOs was to solicit families that were interested in donating a piece of foam from a product in their home that was currently in use, so that we could analyze them in my laboratory to determine if a flame retardant was present, and if so, what the concentrations were and what type of flame retardant it was. There's a little bit of ambiguity at this time of whether the California standard was even being applied to a lot of these baby products, things like the car seats, nursing pillows, changing table pads. A lot of these products contain polyurethane foam, and we had seen the TB117 label on some of these products, but it wasn't really clear how often it was used and what type of chemicals may be present in some of these products. So again, this was one of the motivating factors for this study. And then based on the results, we were really interested to see how well some of the results compared with the residential furniture, which was the motivation for Project 2 on residential couches, where we did the same thing with the help of several NGOs. People that were interested in knowing what flame retardant might be in their couch, they actually took a small biopsy, a small piece of foam out of the cushion in their couch, and sent it in to a group at Berkeley that organized them. They labeled them and then sent them to my lab for analysis. And In the case of the couch study, we were very interested in collecting information from the volunteers about the state and date at which they purchased their couch and whether or not it did have that TB117 label in it, just to get more informed information about the use of these chemicals. So moving to slide 17, just a little background on what we did. We take a small piece of foam, we sonicate it in some solvent, and because they're additive, they come out really easily. Moving to slide 18, then we can run them on our mass spectrometers. If anyone watches CSI, you see kind of this, they show these instruments all the time. It's kind of funny, but what we can do is compare our results to mass spectral databases to try to understand what chemicals may be present. Some flame retardants are in these databases, some are not. So about more than 50% of the time, we can actually determine what they are with either authentic standards or comparison to this database. There were a few cases where we had to run them on a high-res mass spec to get better information on what the chemicals were, because we knew something was in there, but we didn't know what it was because we had never seen it before. So moving to slide 19, there's some of the results from the Project 1. We screened 101 products, baby products that contain polyurethane foam. 80% of them did contain a flame retardant that we could identify. The two most common flame retardants we found in these products were a chemical, which I use the acronym TDCPP, sometimes it's called chlorinated tris. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit. And the second one was Firemaster 550, which is a new flame retardant specifically put on the market for polyurethane foam by a manufacturer called Chemtura in the US. And we also found, I think, 11 samples with V6, which is a rather new mixture. 5 samples from the 101 did contain penta, but they were all purchased prior to 2005. We also did identify 2 new flame retardant mixtures, which had not been identified before, using that high-res mass spec approach. Really, data from our study helped to pass some amendments to TB117 that exempted some of these products because the state of California didn't have any evidence suggesting that these were the sources of ignition for fire, so they exempted, I believe it was strollers, nursing pillows, and baby carriers, and they're considering exempting a few more too, which would be nice. Because unfortunately, most exposure assessments actually don't consider flame retardant exposure from these products. They really focus on residential furniture, including risk assessments done by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And if you think about it, most infants spend almost 24 hours a day in intimate contact with these products. And if off-gassing to the air is the main route of migration and leaching of these products, then these infants are getting the greatest exposure because their nose is in close proximity to the surface of these materials. So this really raised a lot of concern about exposure to infants. If you move to slide 20, you can see here's some results from the couch study. In this case, we had 102 samples, and we had better information on where they were purchased. So most of the samples in our study were collected between 1985 and 2010. Here, 87% of them had a flame retardant we could identify. In this case, chlorinated tris, PBDEs, and Firemaster were the most common flame retardants we identified. But as you'll see in a moment, all the PBDE detects were certainly in furniture purchased prior to 2005. So we do really think that penta is not present in furniture bought more recently or on the market now. And in this case, we also identified 2 new mixtures of organophosphate flame retardants that, again, had not been previously known or identified in the literature before. So advancing to slide 21, just trying to get through these last slides quickly. I know I'm taking up a lot of time. I want to make sure I have time for Pam. This table is actually present in the publication if anyone wants to get access to it. It is publicly available through the Environmental Science and Technology Journal. Basically what we found is there was a wide variety of flame retardants that were being used in residential furniture, particularly since the phase out of the penta. Previous thought was that PBDEs were the only flame retardant used in furniture prior to 2005, but our study demonstrated that chlorinated tris, or TDCPP, was also used prior to 2005 at the same time as penta-BDE. In general, most of the flame retardants are found on average about 4 to 5% by weight of the foam, or 40 to 50 milligrams per gram. Since the phase out of that penta-BDE, there's evidence here that we're seeing a wider variety of flame retardant applications in furniture on the market today, which makes it a little more difficult to try to track exposure, and because we first need standards for these chemicals to make measurements in indoor environments. And these mixtures are proprietary, and so we just really determined what their structure was in this paper. And a last result from our study really suggested that, that TB117 is a de facto standard for the U.S. because we had high use both inside California and outside California. And while the presence of the TB117 label was a good indicator of flame retardants, a lack of a TB117 label was not a good screen for a lack of flame retardants. About 50% of the products that did not have a TB117 label still contained flame retardant chemicals. So TB117 label is not always a good screen for the presence or absence of a flame retardant. Advancing to slide 22, this is just an example of output from our mass spec where we identified this new flame retardant mixture. So this is present in 8 samples where we found these 4 different components in the foam. There's really not a lot of health information out there on these compounds. Again, they're proprietary. I can't even get standards for them. So we were able to determine their structure from our mass spectrometry analysis, likely structure, but we can't make measurements yet on exposure because we don't have standards available. So advancing to slide 23, this raises questions about the health risks from these new flame retardants. And if you move to slide 24, TDCPP or chlorinated tris was actually a flame retardant used in the 1970s in children's pajamas. And then researchers at Berkeley found that it was a potential mutagen based on an Ames assay, TDCPP and its brominated analog, TBCPP. And so they were actually voluntarily phased out. So there's no actual federal ban on their use, and it seems like all along they've been used in furniture for quite some time. The National Toxicology Program did conduct a 2-year rodent study where they found that there was increased incidence of tumors, so it is considered a probable human carcinogen. Some work done by the Consumer Product Safety Commission in a report released in 2006 actually suggested that exposure to TDCPP from residential furniture was greater than acceptable daily doses, or a limit which would increase risk for cancer. Now, the report was based on modeled data because there was no actual measurements on TDCPP in the environment at that time, but I thought that was still of concern since they estimated exposure would be greater than acceptable doses. We've done a lot of work in my laboratory monitoring levels of TDCPP in dust to compare with PBDE measurements, and we find it in every single sample we look for, and the levels are equivalent and sometimes higher than the levels we see for PBDE. So there's no doubt in my mind that there is chronic exposure, particularly for children, occurring for TDCPP in the U.S. We're actually trying to measure exposure by looking for its metabolite in urine, and we do see it in more than 95% of the samples we've examined to date. So slide 25 is just a little information on FireMaster 550. This is a product manufactured by Chemtura in the United States and was primarily advocated as a replacement for penta-BDE. The EPA did have some concerns about health effects and issued a consent order in 2005 for more testing, which we initially thought was on the entire mixture, but only learned a couple months ago was actually only for the 2 brominated components, structures C and D in the figure here. So this was kind of a motivation for my colleague and I to do some further research on this mixture. This was actually a proprietary mixture as well until I was able to get a sample of it, and we actually were able to identify the components. And we had a little bit of the commercial mixture that we were able to test in our own rodent study to look at developmental effects. Now, the components here in this mixture, we have been tracking in indoor dust as well. We do find them in every single sample. The levels of TBB and TBPH here are almost comparable to PBDEs. TBPH certainly is comparable to PBDEs, but we have not yet developed a human biomarker to track exposure, but this is also something we're working on in my laboratory right now, so we can get better estimates on particularly how children are exposed to these chemicals. But advancing to slide 26, we just published a paper a few months ago where my colleague Heather Patisal and I from NC State conducted a small-scale study exposing pregnant rats to FireMaster 550 to better understand if there are potential effects on development of the fetus. So we had a kind of a design where we had a control group, a low dose group, and a high dose group of rats. So our high dose was about 3 mg per kg per day, but this, as you can see, is much lower than the no observable adverse effect level reported by Chemtura, which was 50 mg per kg per day. So what we did is expose the pregnant rats from gestational day 6 to postnatal day 21. So only the pregnant rats were exposed. There's no exposure to their offspring. Any exposure they received was in utero or through lactation. And then we looked at uptake in the parents, the pregnant dams, and then followed the offspring till 7 months of age. And so just a few points of what we found. We did find that the pregnant dams had a significant increase in their thyroid hormone levels upon exposure. We found accumulation of the FireMaster 550 components in both the dams and the pups, so there was transfer to the developing pups either in utero or through lactation. The female pups that were born in the high-dose groups had early onset of puberty, but the most interesting observation we had is that the male pups born in the high-dose group actually had were obese. They were 32% heavier than the controls, and the female pups were 22% heavier than controls. So we do have concern that there are chemical components in Firemaster 550 that may be what we consider chemical obesogens, or chemicals that can reprogram cells that regulate lipid accumulation and adipocytes in developing organisms. This is an emerging hypothesis related to obesity, that certainly while diet and exercise play a role in obesity, there could be some effect from exposure during pregnancy to some chemicals that can change the way cells develop lipid cells or adipocytes. And so we have this concern for Firemaster 550, which we hope to follow up on to collect more evidence and determine whether this is the case or not in the future, because this was a very limited study, but it is suggestive, and certainly suggests to us that it could be an endocrine disruptor. So really, I think most of the discussion points I've kind of covered here throughout the talk, and they're here in front of you. And I want to leave some time for questions and get to Pam's talk, so I'll just end there. If you move to slide 29, I'll just point out that the Chicago Tribune had a really nice series of articles on flame retardants and the issues related to flame retardants, their ties to the tobacco companies. It came out last May. I actually have copies of these articles. If anyone wants to email me, I'd be glad to share a copy with them. They spent over a year on this series of articles. It was front page news 4 days in a row, and they did a really good job reporting on this issue. So I encourage anyone to read them if they have not already. So I'll just end on slide 30 with acknowledgments primarily to my funding agencies and my laboratory group, which do all the work here. And then I'll take any questions if there are any.
And Heather, we're actually going to return at the end for questions. So thank you for your excellent presentation and for sharing the latest research from your lab. I imagine there are questions out there. So I'm going to move on and introduce Pam, and then after her talk, we'll have time at the end for questions.
Okay,
so
sounds good.
Thanks again so much. Okay, now I'd like to introduce Pamela Miller, founder and executive director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics. Pam is known for her work to prompt state, national, and international chemicals policy reform to protect environmental and human health in the Arctic. She is a leader in Coming Clean, a national network of groups concerned about chemicals policy reform. She also serves as a state policy expert for Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, and has been instrumental in prompting the ban of toxic chemicals worldwide. Pam was selected as a fellow for the 2011 Reach the Decision Makers program of the University of California, San Francisco Program on Reproductive Health and Environment. Pam also serves as principal investigator for community-based research projects in the Arctic, which are supported by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. And welcome, Pam. Would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Diana, and thank you so much, Heather, for your important work and excellent presentation. First of all, I'd like to just give a very brief, and I want to allow time for questions as well, a brief update about where we are with state and federal policy that relate to the topic that Heather just spoke about regarding the regulation of flame retardant and other toxic chemicals. And as you probably know, Alaskans, we believe, are at particular risk from exposure to chemicals such as these toxic flame retardants because many of them are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, and they also travel in wind and ocean currents and accumulate in our northern environments and animals as well as people. And here in the north, because our homes are insulated and closed in for a greater proportion of the year, I believe that we have greater exposures, and we'll be looking at this in a project that is funded by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in a project that we're working on collaboratively with the communities of St. Lawrence Island and 2 universities, where we'll be investigating these chemicals in household dust and also in people. And that project is ongoing right now, and I'd be glad to talk with you more about it. We do know that women of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta have the highest levels of these chemicals, the polybrominated diphenyl ethers in the circumpolar Arctic, and we're very concerned because of this new science that's coming out concerning the neurodevelopmental and thyroid effects and other effects that are coming out in the literature these days. And as you may know, last session, the last legislative session, I should say, in our own state legislature, there was a bill to phase out polybrominated diphenyl ethers, including the form known as DECA, or the mixture known as DECA, in furniture and electronics. And this bill was known as the Safer Homes and Healthy Families Bill. It was sponsored by Senator Bill Wielechowski, and we were very pleased that it passed the full Alaska State Senate last April. However, it failed to pass the House, and that was largely because of pressure from the chemical industry, a chemical industry front group that was actually exposed later in the Citizens, it's called Citizens for Fire Safety, and it was exposed in the excellent investigative series that Heather mentioned in the Chicago Tribune, which unfortunately came out after our legislative session closed. So we are very interested in prompting state policy in this legislative session, even though it's somewhat more challenging even than last session. And I think it's important to note that taking on toxic chemicals is a priority for state legislatures across the country this year. We know that at least 26 states will consider policies to address concerns about toxic chemicals in consumer products, including flame retardants. And this is an analysis by Safer States, which is a national coalition of which Alaska Community Action on Toxics is a part, of state-based environmental health organizations. And these bills will cover a broad range of topics, from bans on toxic flame retardants and bisphenol A in consumer products to requirements that states identify chemicals of concern for health and manufacturers disclose the use of these chemicals in products. We know at least 15 state legislatures will consider policies to phase out the use of toxic flame retardants, including chlorinated tris in consumer products such as children's products and home furniture. And Heather talked about chlorinated tris. Of course, it's a carcinogen found in products made of foam, and it's become infamous, I think, because of the chemical industry's intense misinformation campaign that was uncovered last year in the Chicago Tribune series. So many states are considering legislation to phase out these products. We would like to urge our own state legislature to take action on these chemicals, and we'll be working on that. And if you'd like more information or if you'd like to engage on this, please do contact our office. I would also like to mention that there was an historic announcement last Friday concerning the kind of obscure regulation that Heather referred to in California called Technical Bulletin 117. And Governor Brown introduced new fire regulations that will allow for fire safety without toxic chemicals. And I think this has been one of the biggest factors in the use and proliferation of these halogenated chemicals in the world. And this, again, is an obsolete regulation, but it kind of allows the use of these chemicals in many of the products, not only around the U.S., but around the world. It requires manufacturers, as Heather mentioned, to use these chemicals that are marketed as flame retardants to meet a flame test in furniture. And many groups, especially in California, have been working very hard to update this TB 117 so dangerous chemicals don't have to be used in furniture foam. So please be looking for an action alert from us about this, because we're working in solidarity with many health groups in California, and there is a comment period actively open right now that will close on March 26th. And if you'd like more information, we'll have it on our website also, but toxicfreefiresafety.org is a great source of information. And finally, I'd like to just talk very briefly about the Safe Chemicals Act, which is legislation on the federal level, which would replace the very outdated Toxic Substances Control Act that was passed in 1976. And this new law, the Safe Chemicals Act, was introduced and passed out of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the U.S. Senate last year. The sponsor is Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey, And we were very pleased that our own Senator Mark Begich signed on as a co-sponsor in 2012. And this bill will have to be reintroduced in the current Congress, and Senator Lautenberg is committed to doing that. And so we want to urge our senators, both Senators Begich and Murkowski, to support this bill once it's introduced very soon in the 2013 Congress. And essentially what this does is hold the chemical industry accountable for proving the safety of chemicals before they're released on the market. And it does replace this very outdated Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. That's not the opera. And it's very important, I think, in protecting the public health of Alaskans and really people all over the United States. So we urge you to contact our senators. They will be very key in ensuring the passage of this very important legislation in Congress in the coming year. So that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you again, Pam and Heather, and all of you who are participating today. I'd like to now open the lines for your questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, please press *2 to unmute your line. Please also state your name and affiliation, and we ask that you try to be brief so that others have the opportunity to participate. Again, you would press *2 if you'd like to ask a question of either Dr. Stapleton or Pam Miller.
Hello, this is Saru Kaiser from Breast Cancer Action in San Francisco.
Hi.
Hi, I had a question for Heather Stapleton about the reactive and additive flame retardants, and if you could maybe talk a little bit about where we see those reactive flame retardants versus the additive flame retardants in actual products.
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to answer that. So the ability to use reactive flame retardants really depends on what type of material you're trying to treat or flame retard. Most of the reactive flame retardants that are out in the market, the most well-known being tetrabromobisphenol A, is primarily used in things like printed circuit boards and some other kind of epoxy resins where you have greater potential to actually have a chemical reaction between a functional group on the flame retardant and the chemical backbone of the polymer. Unfortunately, in polyurethane foam, foam itself doesn't have the correct functional groups to have a reaction with a flame retardant chemical that would be effective. So there are no viable options for reactive flame retardants that I'm aware of, which is why everything is an additive flame retardant. So it really depends on the polymer and the product. But I know like tetrabromobisphenol A is used often in these epoxy polymers and printed circuit boards and a few other applications. So it just depends on the flame retardant and the polymer.
Okay, thank you. Do I need to mute myself again?
No, I think you can
okay.
Say. That's all right. Thank you for your question, Sarah, and I'd like to invite others to ask a question. *2 to unmute.
While people are mustering up their courage to ask a question, this is Pam. I have a quick question of Heather. Heather, can you tell us really what is known about some of the phosphate-based fire retardants that may be serving as replacement chemicals for the halogenated compounds?
So, certainly chlorinated tris is actually an organophosphate as well, and with the addition of that chemical to California's Prop 65, we hope that means that its use will actually be either eliminated or significantly reduced in the future. But we do have growing concerns about these mixtures of non-halogenated aromatic organophosphates, like I demonstrated in one of the slides with the chromatogram, where we're seeing lots of these mixtures of triaryl phosphates that are alkylated in some of the rings. There's not a lot known about toxicity, but some of them have structures that are very similar to tricresyl phosphate, which is a well-known neurodevelopmental toxicant. And some of our preliminary data on FireMaster 550 actually suggests that it's the organophosphates and not the brominated components that are having some of these adipogenic, obesogenic effects. Again, it's very preliminary, but we're trying to follow up on it, and there's not a lot of research out there, unfortunately. And I know I've contacted some people at the EPA because even in their alternatives assessment, they seem to kind of downplay some of the potential toxicity, and I don't really understand what it's based on, if it's a model structure-activity relationship analysis, or they actually have some other published data. But we do have some concerns about them. They're not as persistent in the body. They don't biomagnify. They are more readily metabolized, which is why we're trying to track exposure through looking at urine. But I mean, just because they don't biomagnify doesn't mean they won't potentially have toxicity either. So I do think it's a big black box. We're hoping that, in the future we'll generate more information on that. And I do know that the National Toxicology Program is also looking into this and doing some neurotox studies on these compounds. So hopefully we'll have some more data in the future, which isn't great, but I know at least there are some efforts to address it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions?
My name is Vai Wari. I have a question for Heather. I want to first of all, thank Heather and Pam for their great presentation. As Pam mentioned, we're going to be doing a study on St. Lawrence Island because of the concerns of our communities. We're already disproportionately affected from military contamination on our island and global contaminants, which we've been researching on a community-based project since 2000. And so we want to take a look at these newer class of chemicals. And I would, what is industries and corporations doing to our children? This is very alarming, what I heard your presentation, Heather, that 80% of our children products, there's tris in it, and they affect the development of our babies, and also reproductive neurological diseases. And we have so much cancer in our people. We've had a drastic jump in cases of cancer just these past, probably the past year. So I would urge anybody on the call, our tribal leaders, to get involved in these very important chemical policy reforms that Pam brought up. So it's very important, because we live in the Arctic and our homes are closed in, as Pam mentioned. But I have a question for Heather. Can you tell us about tris? They're added for product safety, but what happens when tris burns? Are there any effects from that?
You mean during a fire when it burns?
Yes.
Not to my knowledge. There really hasn't been a lot of research focusing on the fate of the tris compound during the ignition process and what it actually would degrade to. I hope that it would not be as toxic as the parent compound. In our bodies, it is metabolized to a product that could potentially be more toxic, unfortunately, which is one of the reasons we're trying to track the metabolite in the urine. We just recently developed that method a couple years ago, and so we're only now really getting better data to understand whether the levels we measure in the urine are actually correlated to the exposure levels we see in the home. Is that associated with any health effects? We just have no information on that right now. So unfortunately, we really can't answer that. But we do know that some of these metabolites, when you look at them, expose cells to them in the culture and test tubes and things like that, they can be more toxic than the parent compound. And that's our concern. And that's what we're trying to understand now.
Thank you. Pam, have you heard anything about that?
Oh, she may be muted.
Yes, I just unmuted my line. Sorry. Yes, and in fact, I think that's something that we would like to urge our legislature to take some action on to ensure that Alaska's children are also protected against chlorinated tris.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more brief Brief question.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, my name is Mari Carmen. I'm from ACAL here, and I have a question. I'm curious because you mentioned that regulation, phasing out is just is important, but it's just one aspect of the exposure, right? That I am wondering the exposure, the people that are already exposed, the exposure that is out there in the people's homes, and I'm interested also in the relation that you also mentioned between the undeserved communities being more exposed. So I'm wondering what would be affordable or prevention measures. What can people do to reduce their exposure, that if they are already exposed, what can they do?
Right. Yeah. No, it's it's a very good question. As I said, that that even though they were phased out in 2005, we're still all exposed to the penta-BDE mixture because many of us still have maybe old furniture in our home that still contains these chemicals, and it's impossible to tell if the chemicals are present there or not. And there's no really good, easy way to test it unless you have a mass spectrometer like I do. So we do know most people are still exposed. There's still sources in the home, and our couch study demonstrated that. Since dust exposure and inadvertent ingestion of dust particles is a well-known primary exposure pathway, the best recommendation that we give to people, and as silly as it may seem, washing your hands as much as you can, primarily before you eat, can actually reduce your exposure to these chemicals. Just like the common cold, washing your hands seems to be a really great avenue for reducing risk for lots of different health concerns. We do find that people that wash their hands less frequently have higher body burdens of these chemicals. And we don't think a lot about, eating dust particles, but unfortunately it's possible that even touching some of these products, like touching your couch, touching your remote, your cell phone, something like that might lead to absorption of these chemicals to the skin oils and the surface of your hand. And then if you were to go eat an apple or a French fry or something, you could potentially transfer that to the food and ingest it. So reducing or just washing your hands as much as possible would help, and reducing any accumulation of dust in your home. Even actually, carpet is known to accumulate more dust than if you had hardwood floors. So anything in your home that you could do to reduce exposure to dust particles would help. And certainly if there's something you found that you knew had flame retardants in it, you could consider replacing it with something that was flame retardant free. But as I said, that's really difficult to identify in the home. It's almost impossible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Heather. And I think at this time, I'd like to give both of our speakers just an opportunity to make some brief concluding remarks, and then I'd like to announce our last call because we are just about out of time. So, Dr. Stapleton, if you'd like to say anything else before we wrap up.
Well, the only thing I'd say is hopefully Governor Brown's new flammability standard in California will have an impact on reducing our exposure to these chemicals in the future. Although, we'll have to wait because the chemical industry is really lobbying against that change. And I've even heard they actually are trying to institute similar flammability standards in other states. Even if the California one gets phased out, they might design a new standard in another state to keep that standard still going. So we'll just have to wait and see. But I think just more information is always powerful to try to increase our information about the use of these chemicals and actually try to push for TSCA reform. That could help as well.
Great. Thank you. And Pam, would you like to say anything else?
Just quickly to say, please engage with us. Please work with us on both the state and the federal level to change the laws. I think that's ultimately going to be very important in order to protect the health, especially of children and future generations. So just urge everybody, bring your hearts and minds to the table and let's make some change.
Thank you. That's a wonderful place to end. I'd like to remind everyone that our recording of this call will be available on our website, and you'll receive an email announcement when it is available. And our next Che Alaska teleconference is on environmental exposures and autism, and will be held on Wednesday, March 6th. Our featured presenters are Dr. Martha Herbert, Associate Professor at Harvard Medical School, and Maureen Swanson, National Coordinator of the Healthy Children Project of the Learning Disabilities Association of America. And you can sign up for the call on our website at akaction.org. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers and all of you for joining us today. And if you value these calls, please consider donating to Alaska Community Action on Toxics via our secure website at akaction.org. If you have additional questions, or comments, please feel free to contact us. Our phone number is 907-222-7714. You can also email me at diana@akaction.org. And thank you all again very much, and have a great day.
Great. Thank you.